I've had a Nintendo Switch 2 for a month now, and I have some feelings about it that I wanted to share with you, which may make the difference in you deciding to pick one up for yourself. I've used the console in all of my typical use cases to see if it's really the right console for you so that you can answer one important question. Should you buy a Nintendo Switch 2? And is it worth upgrading from a Nintendo Switch console if you already have one and love it? Here's everything I've learned from spending the past month with Nintendo Switch 2 and why I think it's worth the money. Let's start with how the console looks and feels when you finally get a hold of one. What you do notice straight away from holding a Nintendo Switch 2 for the first time is the size difference. It is significantly bigger than the Nintendo Switch console, and that difference is something you can feel, as it's not just the screen which is larger on the Switch 2 compared to its predecessor. Even the new Joy-Con with the Switch 2 are significantly larger than I was expecting them to be, which for some may be a worry, whilst for others may be a relief. Holding the Switch 2 for the first time, it does feel like a chunky thing compared to the original Nintendo Switch, but it's definitely not as thick as something like the Steam Deck, which for someone with smaller hands may be difficult to hold. The lightness of the Nintendo Switch 2 makes it comfortable to hold, and the width of the Joy-Con 2 make it a generally pleasant experience when you play in handheld. But what I will say is that at times, I do feel like the Nintendo Switch 2 is a bit big for what it needs to be, and I'm more comfortable holding the original Switch in handheld mode. After a couple of hours of gaming on Nintendo Switch 2, I do notice that my hands start to seize up a bit and that it feels like it's a bit heavy, but resting the console against something or playing in docked mode makes it a much more comfortable experience to play. However, the feel of this is not as bad as the weight of a Steam Deck, which really is too heavy to play for longer than short bursts. I also like that the new Joy-Con 2 attach much more securely to Switch 2 than I was expecting. Yes, there are the metal parts in the side of the Switch 2, which many worried were too flimsy, but in playing the console for an extended period of time and taking the Joy-Con 2 on and off the console many times over, I can't say that I've particularly noticed them being too fragile. The magnets which hold the Joy-Con 2 in place are firm, and I haven't noticed any movement from these over the course of the month, which I am pleased to see. What I do like about the Switch 2 that is different are the size of the new Joy-Con. The size increase of the Joy-Con 2 makes them way more comfortable to hold and use compared to the original Joy-Con. The buttons and joysticks are more spread out, which is really helpful for those with larger hands, and the shoulder buttons on the Joy-Con 2 are much easier to press comfortably when you're using just one Joy-Con 2 for play. Generally, I do like the feeling of the Joy-Con 2, but the new Joy-Con have a slightly gritty feeling to them, which is a little bit jarring. It does make them easier to hold than the original Switch controllers, which do slip out of your hands a little bit, and I think this is down to the subtle flex that is present on the new Joy-Con. It's not something that you can necessarily see except in subtle lighting where there's a slight shimmer on them, but generally I think it's this which is causing them to feel like they're less likely to slip out of your hands, and as a result give you a more comfortable gaming experience. However, what is really disappointing to see with the Joy-Con 2 in Nintendo Switch 2 is that the joysticks here are exactly the same as the ones used in the original Switch. This was confirmed by Nintendo, and if you experience Joy-Con drift with your original Joy-Con, there's a very strong chance you may experience this again with the new Joy-Con 2. After a month of using them, I personally haven't experienced any Joy-Con drift as of yet, so I'm hopeful that they will stand the test of time. But if you are someone who plays mostly in handheld or with the Joy-Con detached from the screen and you are worried about this, it is worth saying that Nintendo has continued their repair service for the Joy-Con both for Switch and for Switch 2, so should you need that, I will leave a link in the description below so that if you do experience Joy-Con drift with the new Joy-Con, you can easily send them off for repairs. What you can do to mitigate some of the risks with Joy-Con drift is to use a separate controller to play your games, and Nintendo has you covered there should you want it. Nintendo have launched a new and updated Pro Controller for the Nintendo Switch 2, which on the outside looks very similar to the original Pro Controller, but from there the comparisons really end. The Nintendo Switch 2 Pro Controller features high-quality buttons and joysticks which make it a real joy to use. No longer is there the clacky feel to the Nintendo Switch 2 Pro Controller where the joysticks hit plastic really hard. On the new Pro Controller, there is a really subtle glide to them, which feels really nice and responsive in games. The controller also seems to be a lot more precise when wandering around games, which is great to see. What I'm less convinced by, though, is the price of the Pro Controller. It is a very expensive accessory, which did increase in price in North America following the announcement that pre-orders were being delayed. You can get away with not purchasing the new Pro Controller. If you've already got the original Nintendo Switch Pro Controller, that will work on the new console. However, if you are intending to use the original Switch Pro controller, you need to be aware that if you try and wake the console with the home button, that won't work. That functionality is only available in the Switch 2 version of the Pro controller. Do you need a Nintendo Switch 2 Pro controller? Absolutely not. There are ways and means around using one, but for me as someone who prefers a traditional controller setup and doesn't really like how small the new Joy-Cons still feel, even in the included controller grip, I do like the Pro controller a lot, and I'm definitely going to use one for the whole generation. Let's talk about the games on Nintendo Switch 2, because I'm not gonna lie, this is where things can fall apart for the console. Being completely honest, there aren't really a lot of games for a cozy gamer to play right now on Nintendo Switch 2. It's always dicey to say there are no games at launch for a console launch because it's not possible for Nintendo to launch all of their games in the first 4 weeks of a console launch. It would lead to us all being bored for the rest of the generation. There are a decent number of Nintendo Switch titles currently available. However, for a cozy gamer, there really is only one option right now, which is Mario Kart World. And being completely honest, I don't think it's the best Mario Kart I've ever tried. The other games which are available are either older titles which have been ported over to Nintendo consoles, or they're remasters or remakes of older titles. Outside of Donkey Kong coming out this month and Metroid Prime 4 coming out later this year, there aren't really any Nintendo games to look forward to this year, which makes me kind of worried. I'm hoping that there are going to be more games announced soon, as I'm sure we'll be getting a direct at some point either later this month or in August, and that would be the perfect time to at least give us something new and exclusive for the Switch 2. However, what I am glad about is that the Nintendo Switch 2 is backwards compatible with Nintendo Switch, so even though there aren't the titles to enjoy on the new console right now, we do still have access to a back catalogue of amazing games, which are the perfect way to fill in the time. I've been continuing to play Animal Crossing New Horizons, and I've been exploring other games in my backlog, which I'm really pleased to finally be able to dive into on Nintendo Switch 2. In order to enjoy some of these games, Nintendo did make the decision to provide some Nintendo Switch games with an upgrade route, but not all of them received one. Depending on the game itself, some received a paid upgrade pack like Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild, whilst others received a free upgrade like some of the Pokemon games. The upgrades for these games, whilst are refreshing for those games, for some may feel like a step too far, particularly with the notion of needing to pay for an upgrade to take advantage of the better processing from the Switch 2 compared to the previous generation. It is worth saying that these upgrade packs are entirely optional. If you don't want to purchase them, you don't have to, and the games themselves will run just fine. The upgrade packs are designed for those who want a little bit extra from their games, whether that's better visuals or extra content. For the games that I've played, sadly none of them did get an upgrade pack, but I'm honestly not too disappointed in this because for me the benefit is still being able to play Nintendo Switch games on a console which does run better than the previous generation. And oh boy do those games run better. The biggest test for me was Animal Crossing New Horizons, as that's had a lot of issues which do need fixing, and the game does perform so much better on Nintendo Switch 2, and I'm so happy with the results. I'll be doing a whole separate video on how Animal Crossing performs on Nintendo Switch 2, so if you want to stick around to see when that video goes live, don't forget to subscribe so that the video goes straight into your sub feed. But how do these games perform generally on Nintendo Switch 2? I can honestly say I was genuinely surprised with how the games themselves performed on Nintendo Switch 2, with the most noticeable difference for me coming from handheld mode. Thanks to the larger size of the screen, it feels like you can see more of your game, and now that the games in handheld run at 1080p, you can really see a noticeable difference in the graphical fidelity. I have really loved the experience of playing games in handheld on my Switch 2. Games look cleaner and brighter than they've ever done. It really is a joy to see. What was less obvious for me was 4K games in docked mode. As only a handful of titles have this option available right now, I haven't been able to take full advantage of this, but the games that do have this feature available really do benefit from it. What was a nice surprise to see is that some of the games offer HDR support via Switch 2, which is what causes the games to look richer in terms of colours. You can definitely see this when the feature is turned on, and it is amazing to have. But what I've found from my own personal testing is that the HDR on Switch 2 doesn't actually work properly. When I tried to calibrate the settings, it messed up for me, leading to washed out colors, and when I tried to correct it again, all of the colors ended up being too bright. Apparently, from reading online, this is a known problem for Nintendo Switch 2 that doesn't always work out too well for the console, and the best advice I have for you is to avoid this completely and not calibrate your Switch 2 when you first get it for docked mode. Instead, go into your settings and turn off HDR, and that will prevent you having the same issues I did. You don't get any difference in terms of the performance of the console itself. It only changes the richness of the colors that are in the games themselves, so you still see them like you would ordinarily. You just prevent the issues with the colors looking washed out on a bigger screen. Performance-wise, the Nintendo Switch 2 is faster than its predecessor, and it allows games to run quicker and more efficiently than they could on the previous generation. In a lot of ways, I personally do feel like the Switch 2 is just a Switch Pro model that we never had. All of the expectations I had for the OLED never came to fruition, and they've been answered with Nintendo Switch 2, and I'm a lot happier to see major improvements to the performance, which has led to improved visuals for games and faster run times. What I am disappointed with, though, is the battery life of Nintendo Switch 2. When the news came out that the battery would last you between 2 and 6 hours, I was really surprised. The original Nintendo Switch on the most graphically intense games could hold charge for about 3 hours, which I always thought was a bit short. So to hear that it was even less on Nintendo Switch 2, it was a little bit difficult to take on board. In a day-to-day sense, I'm finding that these estimates hold up. I managed to play about 2 hours of Mario Kart World from a full charge in handheld mode before it closed down. But I also found I was getting about 3 hours from the less intense game Shop Simulator Supermarket. It is such a wide range on battery life that I honestly can't recommend buying a Nintendo Switch 2 without getting an additional adapter to charge it. But this is also where I ran into other issues. I was finding that where I was plugging the Switch 2 into charge and I still wanted to play, the console was draining the battery quicker than it was actually charging. I originally thought that was because I wasn't using a Nintendo approved charging cable, so I grabbed one from my original Nintendo Switch. But then I encountered the same issue again. As a result, if you are going to purchase a Nintendo Switch 2, I do recommend you get the official Switch 2 AC adapter as well, because it is way more power hungry than I was expecting for a handheld console. It's also worth pointing out that Nintendo have recognized there are other issues with the battery straight out of the box, with some consoles not displaying the correct amount of battery remaining on the current charge. I personally haven't had this issue myself, but Nintendo did release a fix for this, which you do have to manually do yourself, and I'll leave a link in the description below if you need it. So with all of that, is the Nintendo Switch 2 really worth the price you're paying for it, and should you upgrade to one? To be honest, this is really going to depend on how you play Nintendo games and what you're looking to get from your experience. If you're going from an OLED to a Nintendo Switch 2, you aren't going to notice much of a graphical difference, as even though the Nintendo Switch 2 has an LCD screen, the HDR really does lead to a better result for the new generation hardware. However, if you're coming from a Nintendo Switch or a Switch Lite like I was, you are 100% going to see and feel all of the differences this new generation has to offer. With faster loading times and enhanced performance in games, I genuinely feel like Nintendo Switch 2 is worth the price tag, even with some of the battery issues that I've encountered through my time playing the console. I can definitely see myself getting a lot of use from Nintendo Switch 2 both now and in the future. There are going to be a lot of exciting developments for Nintendo Switch 2, and I'm looking forward to see what it has to offer. But what do you think of the Nintendo Switch 2? Is it a console that you absolutely have to have at some point soon? And what games are you going to be playing when you first get your hands on one? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one.